In a city that gave birth to democracy, there were women who weren't even allowed to be human. We are taught to remember Athens as a place of enlightenment. The marble columns, the grand philosophers, the birth of reason and rhetoric. But behind the chants of freedom, behind the shining statues and the praises sung to liberty, lived a different kind of woman. A woman with no name, no voice, no rights. She was a slave. And in ancient Athens, that meant she was not just owned, but used, punished, and broken in ways too brutal for most history books to describe. Her pain was not an accident of war or conquest. It was a system, a ritual, a way to remind her every day that she did not matter. What does justice mean in a place where your body can be beaten for truth? Where motherhood can be torn from you by force, where even your silence can be punished. These women weren't criminals. They didn't rebel. Often they simply existed, but for that they suffered. Before we go further into this dark chapter of history, consider subscribing to Medieval Memories. Your support helps us bring more of these untold stories to light, because this is not the story of great men or epic battles. This is the story of the women Athens tried to forget. Of torture passed off as law, of shame turned into spectacle, of punishment so deep it left scars not only on flesh, but on the soul of the city itself. And among the worst of these punishments was one so degrading, so final, it did not aim to correct behavior. It aimed to erase existence. To understand the suffering of slave women in ancient Athens, we must begin not with what was done to them, but with what they were not. They were not citizens. They were not women in the eyes of the law. They were property bought, sold, and punished as one might punish an ox that refused to pull a cart. By the 5th century BCE, Athens was a city of paradox. While it gave the world the concept of democracy, nearly 1/3 of its population was enslaved. These slaves came from conquered territories, raids, or were born into slavery, and among them, the most invisible were the women. Even freeborn Athenian women lived lives of restriction, confined to the household and excluded from public life. But slave women had even less. They had no legal identity, no recourse, no protection. In a court of law, their word meant nothing unless it came through screams under torture. And if their master harmed or even killed them, it wasn't a crime. It was his right. Most slave women served in domestic roles. They cleaned homes, nursed infants, wove fabrics. Others were sent to work in the dark interiors of textile shops or water mills. But many were used for something far more personal, their bodies, sold to brothels, forced into sexual service, used by their owners and their sons. The law said nothing to protect them, because legally nothing was happening. You cannot violate a possession. The great philosophers of the era, men like Aristotle, did not question this. In fact, they justified it. Slaves, he said, were natural inferiors, born for labor, without reason or will. And female slaves, they were even lower, the embodiment of submission and silence, tools without agency, wombs without value. And so a society that prided itself on freedom made cruelty invisible by convincing itself it wasn't cruelty at all. But the cruelty didn't end with ownership. It escalated into punishments so precise, so targeted, they reshaped the very identity of these women. And in the courtrooms of Athens, the first of these horrors began, not with a whip, but with a question, one that would only be answered through screams. In the courtroom of ancient Athens, justice was meant to be a performance. Men argued, citizens judged, and orators, trained in the art of persuasion, delivered speeches like weapons. But beneath all the talk of law and fairness, there existed a darker reality, one that belonged to the slave. For enslaved women, justice did not begin with truth. It began with pain. By Athenian law, the testimony of a slave could not be trusted unless it was extracted through torture. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. A slave would lie to protect their master unless forced to tell the truth. Therefore, pain became the path to credibility. Imagine a narrow chamber behind the court. A slave woman, perhaps one pulled from a household embroiled in a dispute, is stripped and bound. Her wrists are fastened to a wooden frame, her feet bare, her back exposed. She has not been accused of a crime, she is not on trial, but she holds information, and that means she must suffer. The instruments vary: a corded whip, heated iron rods pressed against the soles of her feet, sharp blades to strip away fingernails, branding irons that sizzle against flesh. As the pain deepens, the magistrates listen, not to her screams, but to her words strained between sobs, judged for truth only when spoken through agony. This wasn't rare. It was routine. In fact, it was expected. One infamous case survives in fragments of Athenian court speeches, the case of Neaera, a former slave accused of living unlawfully as a free woman. Her past was dragged into public view, her sexual history interrogated. Witnesses were called, including slaves whose statements, delivered under torture, were used to shame her. She was paraded before the court, not as a person, but as a symbol of moral failure. The cruelty wasn't hidden, it was applauded. These tortures served two purposes. First, they extracted testimony. Second, they reminded every other enslaved woman watching, your voice is not your own, your truth is not enough unless it is soaked in blood. It was not just physical domination, it was legal ritual, a spectacle of suffering written into the foundation of the justice system, and for the women caught in its jaws, there was no winning. To speak meant pain. To remain silent meant suspicion. Their bodies became instruments of law, bent, beaten, burned until they produced the words others wanted to hear. But not every punishment was sanctioned by court proceedings. Some happened behind closed doors, where no records were kept and no rules applied. Where the law turned away and cruelty became something far more personal. Because in ancient Athens, the body of a slave woman was not just a tool, it was a weapon, an object, and a warning. In ancient Athens, power didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it simply reached out and took what it wanted because it could. For the enslaved women of this so-called enlightened city, sexual violence was not an exception. It was the structure, the rule. The ritual of domination repeated daily, silently, brutally. These women were never asked for consent because legally they could not give it. A slave woman was an object, something to be used, not considered. Her body was never her own. It belonged to her master, and to anyone he chose. Inside the high walls of Athenian homes, a slave girl might serve wine, wash floors, and then be summoned in silence. Perhaps to her master's room, perhaps to the quarters of his son. No one needed to speak of it, no one needed to ask why. Her obedience was expected, her pain irrelevant. The brothels of Athens were full of slave women, many of them just children. They were bought young, paraded nude in public auctions where buyers inspected teeth, hips, and thighs like livestock. Some were marked for soft service, a polite euphemism that hid the violent truth. Others were sold directly into state-owned brothels where they serviced men one after another, hour after hour, day after day. The state profited, the men indulged, the women were broken. But punishment didn't always come through beatings. Sometimes it came through shame. A disobedient slave girl might be dragged into the open courtyard, stripped before the household or guests. Her crime, speaking out of turn, spilling oil, resisting a touch. For this, she might be forced to dance, to sing, to smile while her body was turned into a joke. And if she resisted too much, if her silence became defiance, she could be sent away, not to freedom, but to a worse fate, sold again, downgraded, relocated to the darkest corners of the sex trade where cruelty wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. There was no justice in these acts, no oversight, no protection, because the law did not recognize her as a woman. She was a vessel, a tool. A punishment could be carried out through the same act as pleasure, and no one would question it. But perhaps the cruelest wound was not the act itself, but what it stole. Her name, her dignity, her chance at motherhood, family, or memory. These women were not simply abused, they were erased. But for those rare ones who dared to escape, who raised their voices or tried to flee the unbearable, Athens had a different kind of punishment waiting. A scar that would never fade. One that could not be hidden, even in silence. For a slave woman in Athens, to speak was dangerous, to flee was unthinkable, and yet some still tried. Some ran into the wilderness beyond the city walls. Others sought the kindness of strangers or disguised themselves as free women. And when they were caught, Athens made an example of them, an example written in fire. Branding was not simply a method of punishment. It was a language, a permanent mark etched into the flesh that told the world, this woman disobeyed. Iron rods were thrust into flames until they glowed red, then pressed against soft skin, forehead, thigh, or wrist. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. The woman's screams echoed down the stone corridors, but there was no mercy. Only the hiss of metal and the cold indifference of law. Xenophon and Demosthenes both mention these marks, burns made not just to hurt, but to identify, to strip any illusion of escape. A branded woman could never hide again. The mark exposed her, forever tied her to her owner and crushed any hope of a new life. And still, for some, branding was not enough. There were punishments meant to disfigure, mutilations carried out to break more than the body. A runaway might return with a chunk of her ear missing, the lobe sliced clean with a blade. Others had the bridge of their nose cut or the tip removed entirely, a deformity that made them unsellable on the slave market. It was a double punishment, first the pain, then the destruction of value. Her body no longer profitable, her spirit no longer whole. These acts were not done in secret. They were deliberate performances, a warning to others. This is what happens when a woman forgets her place. But there was more than physical punishment at work. There was symbolism. To brand the head was to mark the mind, declaring her disobedient, irrational, wild. To cut the ears was to sever her ability to listen. To slice the nose was to ruin her beauty, make her visible only as a cautionary tale. It was not enough to break her body. They wanted to alter how the world saw her and how she saw herself. In Athens, scars were not hidden. They were placed like signatures, so that every step she took, every glance from a passerby, every reflection in water reminded her of what she was, a possession that tried to be a person, and failed. But not all scars were seen. Some were internal, slow, silent, and devastating, because in the cruelest moments, Athens didn't punish with fire or iron. It punished with grief, the kind of grief no branding could match. There is a kind of punishment that does not bleed, a wound that does not scab. A silence so deep, it becomes a kind of death. In ancient Athens, the most brutal punishment reserved for enslaved women was not delivered by whip, fire, or blade. It was delivered through motherhood, or rather through its erasure. Slave women were allowed to bear children, but they were rarely allowed to keep them. Under Athenian law, any child born to an enslaved woman inherited her status. They were born slaves, born property, born disposable. And to keep the number of slaves manageable, or to prevent emotional bonds from forming, masters often made sure those children never lived past their first days. Sometimes it was subtle, a command whispered behind closed doors, a midwife who was told to let it slip away. Other times, it was ritualized cruelty. The woman would be forced to deliver alone, in unsanitary corners of the house. No help, no comfort, and when the child came, it might be taken wrapped in a cloth and discarded like refuse, left on the side of a road, dropped into a pit, exposed to the cold. In rarer, darker moments, she might be forced to do it herself, to carry the child to a river and drown it, to bury it, to walk past it and pretend it had never existed. Some were even ordered to parade through the streets with the lifeless body in their arms as a warning to other slave women, to remind them that no bond was sacred, no life was theirs to keep. This wasn't just punishment, it was annihilation. It severed the maternal instinct. It trained obedience through heartbreak. And it hollowed out the one thing no scar or brand could reach, the capacity to love. In plays and fragments of domestic records, you can find traces of this grief. Women unnamed, barely mentioned, standing in the shadows of tragedy. Their cries were never quoted, their loss never mourned. Their stories, if you could call them that, ended before they ever began. To be a slave mother in Athens was to become a living grave, to carry sorrow in your belly, to walk with it in silence. Athens punished disobedience with scars, but it punished love with emptiness, and the cruelest truth. These women weren't punished for rebellion, they were punished for existing in a world that never intended them to survive whole. Because for a system built on control, nothing was more threatening than a woman who loved, a woman who remembered, a woman who hoped. And so Athens didn't just own their bodies, it erased their legacies. In the shadow of Athens' marble glory, there existed another world, one of flesh, pain, and silence. A world built on the backs of women who were never meant to be remembered. Women who were tortured for truth, raped for control, branded for defiance, and punished simply for daring to love. We remember Athens for its ideals, democracy, philosophy, freedom. But what justice can exist in a society where a woman's body is lawless, where suffering is normalized because it happens behind closed doors, in backrooms, in brothels, in silence? The brutal punishments of slave women were not accidents, they were design. Every scar, every lost child, every cry swallowed in darkness was part of the system. A system that demanded obedience and used violence to shape memory and forget the rest. Because if justice begins with the ability to be seen and heard, then these women were erased before they were ever born. So we must ask ourselves, what does it say about civilization when its highest ideals were built on the suffering of those who could never share in them?